Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Center for New Liberalism. If you'd like to support us, you can do so in two ways. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. That's cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Members get a bunch of benefits like access to exclusive podcast episodes, access to our community Slack, and the ability to join their local chapters. Become a member today, support the Center for New Liberalism, and support the podcast. And thanks for listening. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today's episode is a mailbag episode. I'm taking viewer questions that have been sent in and answering them here on the podcast. As a reminder, if you want to get your question answered on the podcast, send it to mailbag@cnliberalism.org. That's mailbag@cnliberalism.org, and you could get your questions or thoughts responded to on the podcast. Without any further ado, I think we should just jump into the topics. We've got a lot of stuff to cover here, a full mailbag, and so let's jump in. Our first question comes from Carter, who writes in about an episode we did previously on food trucks, and wants to talk about the food truck scene in Portland specifically. Carter says that when he moved to Portland from Silicon Valley, he was astounded by the food cart scene, which had over 450 carts in pods, as well as freestanding trucks. And now there are over 600 of these institutions. And Portland also has a lot of restaurants in the brick and mortar category, and they are often shared between the restaurant and the food cart. It's often the same business. It's not uncommon to see headlines like, this popular fried chicken place is opening a restaurant or a cart, vice versa. The restaurant opens a cart or the cart opens a restaurant. And the reason why is that Portland has led in low regulation. They have nearly no requirements for a food cart to have a particular structure, which makes the cost of entry low and thus leads to a proliferation of food carts. I think this is an excellent thing. Carter's suggesting that, we do a follow-up on this episode to specifically talk about Portland. I don't know if we'll be able to do a full episode just on Portland's situation, but it's certainly worthy of a mailbag comment. And, it reminds me how different things are in one city in the United States versus another. The United States is a very decentralized government in some ways. There's a lot of ways in which living in one place in the U.S. is very different from living in a different place in the U.S. And city regulations can be one of those. I think about how Portland apparently has very low regulation, very, very easy regulatory burden, so to speak, for their food carts and their food trucks. And I think about what's happening in New York, and it makes me kind of mad because I live in New York, and it is not that easy in New York. I'm currently working on a project right now with what's called the Street Vendor Project in New York. And basically, street vendors in New York are just regulated to death. There's a cap on permits. You have to have a permit in order to have a street cart or to sell food on the sidewalk, in New York. Normally we call these food trucks. In New York, they're normally more like carts, hot dog carts, halal carts, etc. And in like 1981 or something like this, maybe 1983, they set a cap on how many permits there could be. Only 3,000 permits were going to be issued or something like that. And basically that number has not changed for like decades. And there's no reason for this cap to exist. There's basically no justification behind it other than, well, we kind of don't like it, I guess. And I mean, this is New York City, like food carts, halal carts, hot dog carts, taco ladies, tamale ladies. These are like part of the fabric of the city. And so many of them these days have to work basically unlicensed, at risk of having all their stuff seized because the city just won't issue new licenses. And finally, last year in 2021, the city did say they were going to issue new licenses, but they still haven't gotten around to it. It's been more than a year. They still have not actually issued any new licenses. The whole thing is absurd. New York City overregulates our street vendors to death. There's stories about people getting tickets multiple times a week because, like, their cart is a few inches too close to the curb or something absurd like this. Just some nonsensical regulation that, frankly, just kind of, you hear about it and it enrages you, because these are like the smallest of small businesses. These are immigrant-owned businesses. They're the kind of thing that make up the fabric of the city, and like, they make the city a better place. And why is this where the crackdown is going? With all the things going on in our society, all, rising crime that people are concerned about and things like that. And the crackdown is coming on street vendors. So I definitely appreciate the letter in, Carter. I don't think we're going to end up doing another full episode on this, but I definitely think it's worth talking about and trying to keep out there just the idea that how your local city regulates things, it matters. It matters a lot, even for something small like food trucks and, taco trucks on every corner. We all believe this. Taco trucks are ultimately a small thing, but it is a great example of just the idea that how your local government operates, it really matters. Everybody pays a lot of attention to national politics. We all like to cheer on the national politicians because they're all famous. We all cheer when the person we like does something good. We boo at the hated team that's filled with awful people. And it's easy to do because nationally they're all very famous. And meanwhile, a bunch of people you've never heard of in your own city are making someone's life great or someone's life miserable through, either good policy or bad policy. So it's a reminder that we should care more about local policy. So thank you for writing in, Carter. Our second letter comes from Joshua. And Joshua says, "Hey, Neoliberal, what are your thoughts on the work and attitudes of Judge Richard Posner? He spearheaded the use of economic analysis when it comes to ruling on cases." Thanks for the letter, Joshua. I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with Richard Posner. I have read a lot of his work at Slate, for instance, back when Slate was like one of the premier websites, it seemed like, on politics, internet. On the blogosphere, when we used to call it that. I don't know if any of the Zoomers out there even recall that was a thing. But Richard Posner had either a blog or a newsletter or just a recurring article, whatever you want to call it, at Slate. And it was a really, really good article. I think he also used to write a blog with Gary Becker. I think it was Gary Becker. And I remember reading some of that. That was way back. That was like, I would have been reading that in like university grad school days for me. So like late 2000s, something like that. But Posner was definitely a prolific author of those times, and he helped me understand a lot of legal issues. As for his like judicial philosophies, I don't really know a lot about that. I'm going to just be straight up honest. He seems kind of like he was a centrist. Like, I know that at some point he identified as a Republican, but increasingly over time stopped saying that and like started criticizing the Republican Party more and more, and kind of seemed more just like a mainstream liberal at some point. So I can appreciate that. I can appreciate someone who used to identify as a Republican, but then as the party became more insane, just stopped doing that. That seems to be an intellectually honest thing to do, a commitment to principles kind of thing. Beyond that, I just regret that I can't give much of an opinion here, but, Posner seems like a really, really smart person and a really good communicator. And I think we underrate the ability and the importance of communicators to make a difference. There's the people who will be doing the cutting edge work in any field, economics, technology, law, things of that nature. And those people are obviously really important. We need those people to push the world forward. But the communicators and the popularizers are also pretty important. And this is people like Posner, who, in addition to being apparently a very brilliant judge, was also a brilliant communicator. You can also think about someone like Paul Krugman, who is obviously a Nobel Prize winning economist, but is almost more famous for being an economics communicator, for his columns in Slate and the New York Times, and just how much good he's done by communicating basic economic concepts to the mass audience. I think that is an incredibly important role, and so I appreciate Posner for that, even if I don't, even if I haven't fully studied his legal theories and his kind of positioning within the legal academic structure of ideologies or whatever. So thank you, Joshua, for the question. Our next question comes from Twitter, actually, and comes from a Twitter handle called President Goku, which, if you're an anime fan, I guess you appreciate. And the question is very simple. It says, why does the left hate the global poor? Now, this is a little bit of a joke question. This has been a long-running joke inside neoliberal circles that, when we advocate for free trade and somebody else says, well, you're just taking advantage of, really cheap labor in the third world, the neoliberal will respond, why do you hate the global poor? Now, obviously, this is a joke response, but I do think that there are some interesting ideas here, and I think we can actually explore them for a second about why does the left respond this way, and why do neoliberals respond this way? I think it has to do with kind of how we see the world in different ways sometimes. We're using different modes of analysis to look at the world. The left tends to look at the world through power relationships. One group has power over another group. This group is the empowered group. This group is the disenfranchised group. And so the morally righteous thing to do in almost every single case is to stand with the disenfranchised group against the powerful group. And by definition, almost whatever the powerful group is doing to the disenfranchised group, that is bad and immoral and wrong. And especially if, you have a situation, say, like a factory in the third world that makes clothing for people to wear in the first world. And those people in the third world, or in a developing country, we might say, I don't think we say third world very much anymore. But those people in the developing country are being paid very low wages, especially compared to what you would make in the first world in a rich country. And so someone on the left is going to look at this and see this as a lens of exploitation. The people in the rich country are exploiting the people in the poor country, and that's just all there is to it. That's the lens in which we analyze this. The rich group exploiting the poor group, the powerful versus the powerless. And that's just kind of the way that the left views the world. Now, there are other ways to view the world, and neoliberals typically view the world through more kind of economic analysis lenses. I'm obviously biased. I am the host of the Neoliberal Podcast, so I will try to do this as neutrally as possible. But I do think that this is the correct way to kind of view the problem. This is why I'm here. And, I think what you have to do when you look at this kind of situation is you have to look at what's the reasonable alternative. One of the things that I think kind of passes by the left and isn't recognized enough is simply the fact that global poverty is the default state of humanity. If it were not for the Industrial Revolution and all of this incredible technology that we've had over the last 200, 250 years or whatever, the whole world, aside from a few kings and emperors, would be in permanent global poverty. A bunch of people constantly on the edge of starvation. Most of the planet is doing subsistence farming to just keep themselves alive. That's what human history was. For most of human history, poverty, crushing poverty, is the default. Anything that gets us away from that is actually the deviation, not the norm. And so we have to ask the question, what is the alternative to working in that factory? And usually the alternative to working in that factory in most countries is subsistence farming. You farm and hopefully you grow enough food to feed your family. And if you don't, you might starve. You might have hunger, your children might go without, and someone might die. It's that or something equally bad. When you hear about, stories of people in impoverished countries living in trash heaps and dumps so that they can kind of scavenge through the stuff to make a few dollars a day trying to find worthwhile items or whatever. That kind of thing is the default. With no Western intervention, with no rich country intervention, the default is that countries are poor. And what international trade does, in the case of these factories, garment factories or other kinds of factories, is it provides an alternative. And that alternative is bad if you compare it to rich country living standards, but that alternative is great if you compare it to subsistence farming. We can tell that it's good compared to subsistence farming, number one, because it pays more, and number two, because people are willing to do it. People leave subsistence farms in droves to go work in factories. Anywhere this is an option, virtually any country that has ever industrialized and has opened a bunch of factories has had their poor farming rural population just swarm into the factories. They very much prefer working in the factories to working on the farm. This has happened in country after country. And so I think neoliberals look at it through the lens of, wow, they've been provided a new alternative that helps them do better than they were doing before, whereas the left looks at it more through power dynamics. And, neither lens is inherently right or wrong in all situations, but I think this is why, some neoliberals get frustrated with the left when the left wants to, impose restrictions on trade because they see it as unfair, either unfair to the people in the rich country or unfair to the people in the poor country. It can actually be both. Neoliberals see trade as something that helps both countries. Both countries end up in a richer, wealthier place overall because of international trade. And so neoliberals get frustrated when they see, leftists do something like try to stop trade or put restrictions on trade because they think it's unfair because of some sort of power dynamic argument. It's not that power dynamic arguments can never be correct. Sometimes they can be correct. But in the case of international trade, we know how this works. International trade definitely helps developing countries. Those developing countries would not give it up if you asked them to. They would have to be forced to give it up. And so that's, I think, where this, why does the left hate the global poor? It is really a question about why does the left have so much suspicion towards international trade? And I think that's why. So kind of a silly question, Goku, but thank you for sending it in. The next question comes from Karan, who asks, should the U.S. push for democracy in allied Muslim nations, even at the risk of Islamists taking over? Or should the U.S. focus mainly on prioritizing our interests, which is the status quo? I ask this because of Egypt, where the U.S. helped encourage Mubarak to leave and celebrated because we thought they were going to be on their way to becoming a liberal democracy, only for the Islamist party to win the next election. Then, when there was a bloody military coup by the secular military to remove the Islamist party, the U.S. again started focusing on our interests instead of pushing values in Egypt. This is a really fascinating question, and it's one that I think does not have an easy answer. One thing we have to distinguish is between different kinds of interests for the U.S., because there are kind of hard geopolitical interests, I would say. We want a specific alliance or signature on a treaty. We want this country to deal with Israel in a specific way. We want oil sold in this amount from this country. There's kind of these specific hard geopolitical facts on the ground that we want. In the case of Egypt, we want, access to the Suez Canal to be uninterrupted and prices to be low there or something like that. There's a lot of things. But there's also soft ideological interests that we have. Democracy, I would say, is one of those. I don't think it's the fact that we're, push our interests versus pushing democracy. I would say democracy is one of our interests. It's just a specific kind of interest. The U.S. has an interest geopolitically and ideologically in pushing liberal democracy. We are liberal Democrats, and we want more countries to be liberal democracies, and that is in the U.S. interests, I think. So, first of all, let's just say that we're distinguishing between different kinds of interests. Now, the question still remains, how should we deal with that? And I think the right answer is that we need to encourage democracy where it has its own groundswell of support. And we need to encourage it not in the hard ways that are like boots on the ground military interventions or, covert CIA operations to overthrow a leader. Not necessarily things like that, but things like moral support and messaging. The US is an enormously powerful, influential country. And so just official messaging from the US government can actually make a difference. Knowing that the US is behind a certain faction in a country can actually matter. I think money can make a difference. If, say, in the case of someone like Tunisia, where Tunisia overthrew a dictator and started to have a democracy, and obviously it's a very fragile democracy as soon as that happened. As soon as they overthrow their dictator and they try to set up kind of a legislature, it's a fragile situation. I think coming in with aid and with money and saying as long as you keep on this democratic path, the money keeps flowing, I think that kind of thing can be very helpful. Obviously, you have to be very smart about how you do this, but I think the correct answer is that where democracy seems to have grown up on its own, that's where you want to focus your efforts. I don't necessarily think it's very useful to push democracy in countries where it seems like we're the ones doing the pushing, not the local population. Pushing for democracy in Saudi Arabia would be kind of silly. Like, democracy is not going to take root in Saudi Arabia in the next 20 years or whatever the case may be. That seems vanishingly unlikely. And, when we talk about democracy in the Muslim world, it probably means some political parties are going to get elected that would be Islamist. And you can mean different things by Islamist. I'm sure that there can be moderate Islamist parties, and there can be radical and extremist Islamist parties. I'm sure both of those exist. And, where we can, we should try to encourage things in a more moderate liberal direction. Again, it's in our interest to push things like liberal democracy, but I think that also includes things like human rights and, trying to make sure that basic human rights aren't being disrespected, that people just have basic freedoms of religion, basic freedoms of speech, things like that. Obviously, not every country is going to get to like the full Western ideal of full cornucopia of human rights of all kinds immediately, but we want to encourage positive growth in that direction. And I think that's something we should do, but we also have to recognize the limits of that, and that, not everybody's going to be on board with 100% of our agenda right away. So this is a really tough question. I like to say that foreign policy is one of the hardest areas of policy, and anybody who says that they have a easy answer to most foreign policy questions is probably trying to sell you something. They're probably an ideologue who has no idea what they're talking about, or they're trying to just sell you a specific solution. Foreign policy is really, really hard. I think the best we can do is muddle through. We should keep pushing democracy where it looks like it has its own chance to grow in the native population. We should do that through soft measures rather than hard measures. And, if Islamist governments pop up, again, we try to encourage them to be moderate and kind of liberal Islamist governments as much as we can. Because democracy, if we're going to be promoting that, does mean that the people are going to choose their own governments, and we can't choose for them. So, we try to have influence where we can. And there's no defined way to do that. You've kind of got to muddle through, and every situation will be different. I wish there was an easier question that we could just say, this is what you do. That's the neoliberal way, and it always works. But that's not how the real world works. So thank you for the question, Karan. Our next question comes from Charlotte, and Charlotte asks, what do you think of Adam Tooze? And there's a bunch more here. There's like a paragraph about Tooze, but I'm going to skip over that. The meat of the question is basically just, do you read Adam Tooze, chart book, and the other things, I guess, that he's written? And what do you think of Adam Tooze? This question actually inspired me to write a brief Twitter thread the other day. I think Adam Tooze is someone who's interesting to follow in that he's a very good collector of information. If you read his kind of chart book series, it's always filled with lots of graphs and lots of descriptive statistics about the world. And in that sense, I think Tooze is quite valuable in that you learn a lot of things. You learn specific facts about the world that sometimes are even quite obscure, that are meant to be illuminating about, something that's going on, whether it's facts about Chinese industry, or facts about international trade flows, or facts about semiconductors. It's usually economic or geopolitical of some kind. And so I think that obviously that's good. And Tooze is a great collector of that kind of information. He writes quickly. He absorbs a lot of information. At the same time, I think Tooze has this worldview that is borderline farcical at times, borderline like cultish. One of Tooze's favorite things to talk about, and probably the thing that embodies him most, like the most Toozean of his ideas, is the idea of the polycrisis. The polycrisis is something that Tooze writes about a lot. It's this kind of loosely defined idea that basically is like, we're having this big existential crisis that's slowly unfolding in the modern world. And it's not just one crisis. The polycrisis is like a bunch of crises all happening at the same time. And like, it's kind of these, I don't know. I think of this as a very silly idea, to be honest. It's a silly thing that otherwise smart people take seriously for some reason. And I am just against the idea of polycrisis as a concept. Polycrisis to me is a deepity. This is a technical term. It's not an insult. If I'm being real, it definitely is an insult, but it's also a technical term. Deepity is something I think the philosopher Daniel Dennett coined a while back. A deepity is something that appears very deep and profound at first glance, but it's actually meaningless, trivial, when you examine it more closely. Think about something like the phrase, love is just a word. Okay, that sounds kind of profound when you say it, but what does it actually mean? A deepity is normally something that's like true, factually, but like in a weird, like trivial way. Love is just a word. Okay, yes, love is just a word. Factually, I guess you could say that's true. But the deepity normally implies some sort of deeper meaning or like deep insight that is just absurd. It's not there. What kind of deep insight are we actually getting from love is just a word? Like, come on. There's nothing there. And I think polycrisis is a great example of this. So if you define polycrisis as the idea that like geopolitics and economies are complex and they're interconnected, okay, that's pretty fine, but that's trivial. We didn't need a word for that. Or, when you have a crisis, it affects more than one economic system at a time. Okay, again, that's true, but kind of trivial. These things are banal. They're not interesting. This is not an interesting insight that required a new word, a new fancy word, polycrisis. But there's kind of this implied deeper meaning to the polycrisis that like almost borders on mysticism. Like Tooze puts together these crazy charts of like 30 different things. Inflation connects to gas price and connects to Russia, connects to the 2016 election, connects to the German government policy, connects to the Italian government, connects to the refugee crisis, connects to the Biden administration. And there's all these arrows flying everywhere. And he looks like that meme from like the Pepe Sylvia meme from It's Always Sunny, where the guy has like red lines and like the big board behind him. And, it looks like a crazy person. This is what the polycrisis is implying, is that there's like some kind of crazy deep truth to what's going on. And it's almost mystical. Like, like any cult, it has its own kind of crazy language. Rather than just saying, well, there's some interconnected shocks going on, it says polycrisis. And rather than saying, I'm going to draw a crazy person arrow chart, he calls it a Krisenbilder, because Krisenbilder is cool and German and vaguely Marxist. And like, I just disagree with the whole concept that, like, number one, the current age is unique. It's not unique. That we're not having any more crisis than normal. History is always having crises, and like, here's a good test, I guess, to wrap up my point on twos. Here's a good test on whether or not polycrisis is useful as a concept. Could you apply polycrisis to the past at any point? And the answer is yes. You could pick any year from the last 300 years and call it a polycrisis. And if your term applies to everything, then it's probably meaningful to nothing. If your term is so broad and can be used in such a way that it applies to every development over the last 300 years, it's probably not a very useful term. And I mean, think about it. The Cold War, that was a polycrisis. All sorts of systems were in flux and in crisis during the Cold War. The World Wars, World War I, World War II, polycrises. The Great Depression, polycrisis. The Scramble for Africa, polycrisis. 9/11 was a polycrisis. The Taiping Rebellion in China, the Napoleonic Wars, the Panic of 1873. Like, you can just kind of go down the list and at any point in history just pick out something, and it was a polycrisis. It was this crisis that affected multiple institutions and geopolitical entities and economic sectors. And like, it's just a fancy word to make people feel like they're living through a special time right now. And they're not. Right now is not special. Maybe it feels special because you're living in it, but there's always economic crises going on. They used to be worse than they are now. The ones we have now are actually pretty tame. There's always geopolitical instability going on. There's always wars going on somewhere in the world. This is just how humanity works. The current time is not special. The current polycrisis is not notable in any way. And so, I don't know. When I think of twos, I think of that kind of, he's interesting, he gathers a lot of information, but he puts them together in these kind of grand theories that don't hold up. If you buy some sort of grand worldview from Adam Tooze, I think you're kind of being suckered into something. So that's my general view on twos. Want to say thanks again to Charlotte for the question. The next couple questions, we've got a couple of quick hitters. The first one from Chris is, who are some of your favorite pundits? I think this depends on what you mean by pundit. I mean, in terms of like, if you ask me for like one opinion haver and like a person whose job it is to just have hot takes, I honestly think it's hard to beat Matt Iglesias. Matt has a pretty strong level of take. I find his level of analysis pretty strong in almost all cases. I do disagree with him sometimes, but I think his style of writing is really good. And I think that he makes high quality arguments most of the time. And I think he also just has high quality arguments on a very broad variety of subjects, both economic, political, social, cultural, etc. I think he's got a really keen eye for analysis, and that he's often early to subjects. He's not repeating just a bunch of takes that have been warmed over, from 15 other commentators. So Matt Iglesias would probably be like one of the people who first jumps into my mind. If you're talking about the kind of person who's more like, oh, well, they're writing a regular article at a place like Slate or Vox or The Atlantic or The Bulwark or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of people, but Jerusalem Dimsis jumps to mind. She works at The Atlantic. Obviously, she's a journalist. Previously at Vox, she writes about housing and many other things, but housing is a big, big part of it. I think of Future Perfect at Vox is really good. Kelsey Piper and Dylan Matthews in particular are some of kind of the OGs of the Future Perfect, and I really appreciate them. Those are some of the ones. I also just think that, in terms of pundits, it's worthwhile to assemble kind of a collection of people that are your experts on a given topic. I know that if I want to talk about trade, I can go talk to, Scott Lincecum and Ed Gresser and talk with them or read what they're writing. And those two guys are like people who I really respect on trade. If I need to think about housing, I can think about Emily Hamilton at Mercatus or Jenny Schutz at Brookings. And those two women are extremely talented at breaking down housing issues and the housing market and policy in that area. And you kind of just go through this like list of things. And for every issue area, if you read enough, you'll start to kind of figure out who are the people who I should respect in this particular issue area. And, I would never go to Jenny Schutz and ask her to like give me like, what should we do about like hormone blockers for trans teenagers? Because that's not her area. But I do know people who I can go to for that. There's people who I do respect in that area. Or I would never go to the people who deal with LGBTQ policy and ask them to weigh in on international trade flows. Like for every tool, there is a purpose, right? So that's another answer. Number one, I've given you a few names, but number two, just cultivate a wide variety of people who you think are experts in their fields. And I think that's a great way to think about who are your favorite pundits. Or you could just listen to me. I'm your favorite pundit. And if you need a backup, go to Matt Iglesias. So that's the short answer. Another short one, another quick hitter comes from Reddit. And the Reddit user unknown _ at the end asks, is Paul Krugman still as based as 90s Krugman? I think it's impossible. No, he is not. I do think like 90s Krugman was such a high standard. I kind of feel bad for the people who've never gotten to read 90s Krugman. When Paul Krugman was writing in the 90s, he was just unfathomably based. He was just an incredible writer who was willing to push against kind of dumb viewpoints and school people on basic economics. And he had some really, really incredibly insightful writing. It's become a meme at this point, like 90s Krugman is the best Krugman. But I do think it's true. I think there's truth behind that kind of jokey saying. If you, the listener, have never read like prime 90s Krugman, there are two works that I think I would recommend to you. The first is Pop Internationalism. It's a book by him. And the second is The Accidental Theorist. These are two books. The books are really not classic books in that they cover like all one subject area. They're both really more like collections of essays. So, you can just pop in, read one essay, take you 20 or 30 minutes, come back another day, read a different essay. But both of them are excellent. They are just collections of his writing about economics and about how the general commentary class, the pundit class, gets economics wrong in so many instances. How they get international trade wrong, how they get, just a ton of economic concepts wrong. So Pop Internationalism and The Accidental Theorist, that's your assigned reading if you want to know more about like how great Krugman used to be. Krugman still has some valuable insights, but I do think that he kind of recycles a lot of his hits at this point. He's got 8 to 10 articles that I think he kind of cycles through. And, there was a period of time when Paul Ryan was in office. And even after Paul Ryan left office, Paul Ryan was no longer in Congress, no longer Speaker of the House. Krugman must have written the column, Paul Ryan is a fake wonk and you should hate him. He must have written that 10 to 20 different times. He wrote the same thing over and over. And I think he's fallen into that a little bit. So it happens to the best of us. I don't think anybody can keep up a high level of punditry and commentary for like 3-4 decades in a row. But, Yeah, definitely go read 90s Krugman if you like really insightful economic commentary. Our next question comes from Jimmy. Jimmy says, "Hi, Jeremiah. I'm a big fan of Cal Newport. He's a computer science professor at Georgetown University who's a big advocate for digital minimalism. That is, deliberately cultivating your life to make it more meaningful, make sure your attention isn't being cut into slivers by all the notifications and algorithmically curated content." So, saying that, he says he's got a few questions. Number one, how do you and the project and PPI at large try to convert online enthusiasm from the subreddit and Twitter into actual meaningful activism and change? How do you balance needing to be online to mobilize the community without being so online to the point that you make the movement irrelevant? Do you feel like other movements with large online presences, like the DSA, balance this issue successfully? I think this is an absolutely fantastic question. Maybe the best question we've gotten this podcast so far. So Jimmy gets an A+ and a gold star and all of that. So congratulations, Jimmy. It's a really good question. It's something that I have spent years thinking about. Probably the best framework I have seen for thinking about this kind of problem has come from Eitan Hersh. Eitan Hersh is the author of a book called Politics is for Power, where he makes the very basic, very normal point that politics is meant to be used to exercise power on society. That seems like a pretty basic point, but you'd be surprised how insightful it can get, because most people actually don't treat politics as though it was for power. They kind of treat politics as a sporting event. This is like you're cheering for your favorite television character in Game of Thrones. I want, Tyrion to become the king of the Seven Kingdoms, right? Sit on the Iron Throne. Well, no, I want Daenerys to sit on the Iron Throne. I want Jon Snow to sit on the Iron Throne. A lot of people actually just treat politics like this. They say it's a life or death thing. They say this really matters. They say it's this incredible struggle. But do they actually do anything in the real world that would make that make sense? Like if this is this life or death struggle, are you doing anything other than voting, I guess? But voting seems like the bare minimum. Are you out there knocking on doors? Are you out there petitioning your city council? Have you personally done anything politically active, like real political activism of any kind? Just knocked on a few doors? For most people, the answer is no. They treat politics like it's, cheering for their favorite television character, cheering for the sports team that they love. They watch the sports team on television. They consume news about the sports team. But, they don't actually go out and play the game themselves. They're not on the field. Hersh calls this political hobbyism. And he says political hobbyism is bad for the country. And I do think there's a lot of political hobbyism out there. And there's a lot of neoliberal political hobbyism as well. This is true for every ideology. There are people who want to post about it. There are people who want to, write about it on Twitter and Facebook. They read lots of news. They follow lots of political coverage, and they post about it on Twitter or Reddit or wherever. But they don't do anything. And those people are political hobbyists. Our goal is to try to convert some of those political hobbyists from hobbyists into actual activists. We're not going to get all of them. We're not even going to get most of them, but we're hoping we can get some of them, some substantial minority of them. Because if we can do that, then we can harness a lot of energy and exercise a lot of power. And that is Hersh's point, is that ultimately, what do you care about in politics? You don't care about following it. You care about exercising power. You care about reshaping society in the way that you think it needs to be reshaped, in the way that you think it should be influenced, in the direction you want it to go. That's what we care about. We've done that primarily through our local chapters. We try to promote our local chapters pretty heavily through our main channels, through, the Twitter and the subreddit. We post about the local chapters very frequently, and we want people to get more involved. If you're a podcast listener who doesn't, frequent the Twitter or the subreddit, or you haven't heard of them before, please go to our website, cnliberalism.org, and check out our local chapters. We have local chapters in something like 60 plus cities around the United States, and we have international local chapters in something like 15 to 20 different countries. These local chapters are the ones that are actually making a difference. We at the national organization are trying to do some stuff on Capitol Hill. We try to lobby Congress people. We do have some contacts. We're slowly becoming a tiny bit influential, I guess. Like we're still a very young organization, but there are some Congress people who know what we are doing now and who know who we are and who talk to us. But I think that pales in comparison to the work that our 80 plus local chapters are doing out there trying to influence local elections, protest in favor of local policies. I think all of that is really the future of the movement. And so if you're interested in this kind of thing, if you don't want to be a political hobbyist and you want to be somebody who makes a difference, then I would definitely encourage you, again, go to cnliberalism.org and check out our local chapters. There's probably one near you, and see how you can get involved. Jimmy has a couple follow-up questions, and I think these will probably be the final questions for the episode, so we'll take them in turn. The first follow-up question is, how do you view Facebook and all social media's role in political discourse? How much of a responsibility do social media sites have to curb misinformation and online extremism, and what role does government policy play in this? This is, again, a really hard question, and I struggled with this, especially, for instance, when Twitter started banning people in the wake of the 2020 election for election disinformation. I really struggled with it because at a baseline, it's a very bad thing if we are asking social media companies, private companies, to be like the arbiters of what is true and what is false. It's not something that they are equipped to do. Ultimately, if it is a social media company's job to determine what's true and what's false, and like we're going to delete misinformation, they are not prepared to do that. And you even saw this with COVID, I think, at some point. There were two main things, I think, that in 2020, Twitter and other social media sites as well sometimes, but I'm going to mainly focus on Twitter. Twitter started banning people for posting the wrong things for two main things. It was election disinformation, baseless claims that the election was stolen. And then it was COVID misinformation. Talk about how you could inject bleach and, it would cure your COVID, or the vaccines are Satanist tools or whatever. I don't know. Both of those things, to some degree, could get you banned from Twitter. And I think you saw this backfire at some points with the COVID stuff because they banned a lot of people who were spreading harmful misinformation on COVID. But I think they also deleted at some point and put like warnings on stuff that was actually legitimate COVID information because they simply had a very difficult time telling, in some of these very nuanced debates, they had a difficult time telling what was true and was not. Because obviously there's some very obvious stuff like, COVID vaccines are made from aborted fetuses and blah, aborted cow. I don't like, they're poison. There's like very obvious disinformation. There's the, shining bright lights on your testicles will cure you of COVID kind of like there's very, very easy disinformation. But then there's other stuff like, well, I've already gotten 2 shots and I've already gotten infected as well. Should I get a booster, or is it actually like something like there are questions where, I'm in this particular population subgroup that's not very much at risk. Should I wear a mask in this particular situation if I've already gotten vaccinated? And there's kind of a party line of like always wear a mask. At one point, that was kind of the thing. And then there's maybe a more accurate answer. Well, in this specific situation, you might not need to. And Twitter was not any good at the nuanced parts of that. They were good at cracking down on obvious disinformation. They were not good at the nuance. And I think this is what you'd see in almost any situation. So I am baseline skeptical that we should rely on social media companies to be the arbiters of truth. With that said, I am sympathetic to Twitter, and I think they did an okay job overall. I think if you're going to be banning people for disinformation, you need to have a really, really high bar for that disinformation in terms of it needs to be really bad and have a really clear cut, like this is doing a lot of harm to a lot of people. The potential for harm here is really, really, really high. And that's the only case in which that kind of thing is necessarily justified. Now, the two cases that they mostly banned for were, again, COVID disinformation, which is the largest global pandemic we've seen in a century at least. And so disinformation about the largest pandemic we've seen in a century, I think that might pass the bar for like the potential for harm is really, really high here. So maybe even though we think this is a bad idea, we should do some disinformation control here. Okay, I can see the argument for that. The second one is the 2020 election and kind of banning people for denying the election or spreading election disinformation. And again, the potential harm from election disinformation to me seems like, yeah, that could really easily spiral out of control in horrible ways. January 6th happened. And, the public seems to have forgotten it at this point. The public is not interested in January 6th anymore. Apparently, that's what the polling tells us, which is very scary. But I don't think we were that far away from like something really disastrously bad happening. Members of Congress actually getting killed. I don't think that was actually very far, out of the realm of possibility in what actually happened. And so, again, when you look at that, okay, election disinformation, it's bad to be the arbiters of truth, but the potential for harm here is really, really high. Oh, I see the argument for why they did what they did, especially when a sitting U.S. president was basically saying, I'm not going to leave office. This is fake. This is fake news. I'm not giving up power because I really won. And you're just allowing him to amplify that message. That's a really, really harmful thing to amplify. So that's generally how I think about it. I think that allowing them to be the arbiters of truth is a bad idea, but in some isolated circumstances, I see the argument for it. The final question here from Jimmy again, very thorough question, Jimmy, and thank you for the submission, is now that you've taken a leadership role with the project, how have you been able to fulfill your responsibilities without social media getting in the way? Have you ever thought about deleting your Twitter because the bitterness of political Twitter keeps encroaching into your life? Does it make you, mentally unhealthy? How do you avoid that conundrum of wanting to join Twitter because it's originally interesting and it connects you with talented people, but it could also make you bitter and, make you angry and waste your time? I will give kind of an unhelpful answer here, Jimmy, and I will just say that I am a big social media person. For me, it actually plays a pretty fulfilling role in my life. And what is it healthy or is it not healthy? Look, I could debate back and forth, but I've been a huge social media person for as long as I can remember. Even before social media proper was a thing, and people were more posting on forums. Back when forums were the biggest social media, I was on some of the biggest forums. I've always been kind of a poster. I posted a bunch on these forums, and then once Reddit became a thing, I was big on Reddit, and now I love to post on Twitter. And for me, it's actually energizing. I don't really get angry or I don't think it makes me a worse person, more cynical, more angry. I think it makes me more informed and lets me do my job better. And so I think I'm kind of an alien in that I don't think it actually negatively impacts me at all. And maybe this is just my form of denial. I don't know. That could be the case. Maybe I'm in denial. But for me, I think I get a lot of good out of social media, out of Twitter and Reddit and a lot of other things. And to me, I just don't see a whole lot of negative downsides. I think it's pretty clearly not true for most people. And I think that I just have some sort of weird brain chemistry where it just doesn't get to me. There's a lot of stuff out there. Look, and I started a social movement where we call ourselves neoliberals intentionally. I am clearly able to take abuse on some level. I would not have done that, and I would not have continued doing that if I was not able to laugh off people hating me on social media. So on some level, I'm just prepared for it, I think. It's not a helpful answer to anyone else. And I think reducing your social media usage for most people can be a good thing, especially if you are a political hobbyist. Look, political hobbyists probably make up the core of my audience. And so I'm kind of telling them to stop listening, which is a dumb idea. Don't stop listening. I love you. Keep listening forever. But at the same time, the whole Eitan Hersh, politics is for power thesis is that political hobbyism is kind of bad for you unless you're going to do something about it. Unless you're going to actually get involved, you shouldn't pay attention to politics as much as you do. You especially shouldn't post about it on social media as much as you do. Social media politics is bad for you unless you're actually going to be doing real politics in the real world. So that would be my advice for most people. For myself, I'm just kind of, I don't know. I love it, and I'm probably not going to stop. So that's me. And that is also the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As one final reminder, if you want to be included in the next mailbag episode, send us a note. Send us a question, a thought, anything you'd like to mailbag@cnliberalism.org. It's the Center for New Liberalism, cnliberalism.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.